Okay, life during the Civil War is section 3. So we're going to talk about not necessarily the soldiers. We're going to focus more on women, children, people like that. Just regular civilians and how they had to adjust to life during this time period. So our three objectives, we're going to identify the changes in lifestyle, okay, going from just peacetime to wartime. We're going to describe conditions of hospitals and prison camps. There's some medical things that are done that are kind of different and new. A big thing is amputation. Is a big thing that they're going to do and have a lot of success with for the most part. So that's something that's kind of different. And then we're going to analyze political and economic changes that occurred during this time. There's a split in the Democratic Party during this time. The Republicans pretty much stay united because Lincoln is doing a pretty good job at leading the party. So we'll talk about that, and then the economy is it's all over the place. So we'll get into that here. All right, so a different way of life. Many schools and churches served as hospitals during the Civil War because you're not going to school or church anymore. So it's easier just to convert those to hospitals. It's kind of like right now with this pandemic going on. The schools, well, not schools, but like colleges, they're all being converted into areas where we can have a lot of hospital beds and things like that. So, similar parallels there to something that's happening in your life today. So, most of the war destruction was in the South because that's where most of the fighting takes place. The northernmost battle is Gettysburg. Otherwise, all the rest are south of that. As armies came through, Southerners lost crops and sometimes their homes. Basically, the troops would come in, kind of slash and burn everything, and then move on to the next place. Um, Took everything they could to eat, and then left after that because that's what they needed to do to survive. Um, the soil was also beat up pretty good, a lot of destruction. There were food shortages and everyday supplies were also in a shortage. Common household items were also scarce. Uh, it was a tough time to be in the South. The continuing war caused shortage. Okay, there it is right there. Shortages and everyday supplies. All right, so the new roles for women. Um, During the war, women worked to keep their communities and families together despite economic struggles. It was their job to kind of try to keep things going. They had to stress. They were stressed because their husbands were away at war, and the pain of losing family members would get to them sometimes. They struggled to keep families together. They didn't have a lot of money, so they had to cut back on things and go without many things that they were used to. Some ways that they will contribute. Okay, on both sides, the Confederacy and the Union, they would serve as nurses for the wounded, but not everyone welcomed them. They thought, oh, women can't take care of us or whatever. But one of the most famous people during this time, women, Mary Edwards Walker, she became the first female Army surgeon and later received the Congressional Medal of Honor. Dorothea Dix helped persuade officials to let women work as nurses. She became a superintendent of nurses for the Union Army and recruited large numbers of women to serve. Another one is Clara Barton. She was famous for her help working with wounded soldiers. She will help with founding of the Red Cross. And then Sally Tompkins set up a hospital for soldiers in Richmond, Virginia. She held the rank of captain in the Confederate Army and was the only female officer in the Confederate forces. So, women make some pretty big contributions here during this time. Women also served as spies uh, for both sides. Others chose to disguise themselves as men so they could become soldiers. Women did this a lot uh, during this time, trying to be spies or trying to disguise as men and things like that. One example of this is Rose O'Neal Greenhow. She gathered information about Union plans and passed them on to the South by posing as an entertainer, like a dancer or something. She was eventually caught and convicted of treason, which is betraying one's country. There were some other people who did this. Harriet Tubman was famous for the Underground Railroad, which was helping people escape the South, and it also disrupted Southern supply lines. That wasn't actually a railroad. Basically, they just go from house to house trying to get to the North because they were famous there. Yeah, so that's women as spies or becoming soldiers. Now, the captured and the wounded, how did they deal with life? Both the North and South kept captured soldiers in overcrowded prison camps. They kept prisoners of war during this time period. Prisoners often had little food or warm clothing, and thousands died of diseases. There was a prison in Georgia that opened in 1864. It was built to hold 10,000 prisoners. By August of 1864, 33,000 soldiers were kept here. The men slept in holes dug in the ground. All they received to eat each day was a teaspoon of salt, 3 tablespoons of beans, and 8 ounces of cornmeal. They drank and cooked with water from a stream that also served as a sewer. So they drank from the sewer. And about 13,000 Union soldiers died there, mostly from disease. A prison in the Union that was in New York had captured soldiers and they suffered through the winter months without blankets and clothes. The hospital was located in a flooded basement. A pond within the compound served as a toilet and garbage dump. And almost 1/4 of all prisoners died at this New York hospital. So, they were not ideal situations or conditions, but it was the best that they could do on the time that was given to them. So, they suffered overcrowding, unclean water, stray bullets because they were right there. The hospitals were right there. Disease spread quickly in soldier camps, sometimes killing men before they could battle. Disease would spread quickly, and at times some regiments lost more than half of their men before they even fought. So it was not ideal, but it was an upgrade from what it had been in previous wars fought. And just with all the destruction and things they're trying to move, they have to be reactive instead of proactive because things are happening so quickly. So they just have to learn to do it and do whatever they can the best. Now, as far as political and economics here, there's the War Democrats and the Peace Democrats. We'll get more into them on the next slide, what they each kind of stood for and whatever. The War Democrats in the North support the war. The Peace Democrats wanted to end the fighting and reunite the states. So this is Democrats in the North, and we're just talking about the Union because the Confederacy has different stuff. So there's War Democrats and Peace Democrats. During the war, both sides passed a draft that required some men to serve in the army. Now, Let's click the rest here. Okay, so before we get into that, some other things here. Um, we'll get into their nicknames for the Peace Democrats and the War Democrats. Now, uh, as a way of dealing with war opponents in the North, President Lincoln passed something called habeas corpus, and that is a legal process that helps ensure the government has a legal right to keep someone in jail. So, uh, a government can suspend habeas corpus, but only when it causes a rebellion or invasion. The public safety may require it. So, he suspended that because he wanted to keep the public safe during this time. If you want that spelling, this is in the book on page 469. It's also a vocab word. Now, these draft laws. In 1862, the Confederate Congress passed a draft that required able-bodied white men between ages 18 and 35 to serve for 3 years. Later, the requirements included men from ages 17 to 50. Exceptions were allowed. A man with enough money could hire a substitute to serve for him. Later, a man with 20 or more slaves did not have to serve. In the North, at first they offered a bounty or a sum of money to encourage volunteers. It also passed a draft. Their draft, men aged 20 to 45 had to register. A man avoided the draft by hiring a substitute or paying $300. Many workers earned less than $500 a year and could not afford these options. In the North and the South, people complained it was a rich man's war and the poor man's fight. That's kind of true because the rich, they're just kind of back watching everything unfold, but the people doing the actual fighting are the poor. So there were riots because of this. The worst riot was in New York City in 1863. Rioters attacked government and military officials, and then they attacked African Americans, and then many of the workers opposed the Emancipation Proclamation and feared that African Americans would take their jobs. After 4 days of fighting, there were more than 100 dead, and finally federal troops were called in to stop the riots. So, the northern economy could better handle the financial costs of the war. The North, their money became known as greenbacks because of the color, so that's why your money is green today. In the North, industry profited from the war. That's why they were able to handle it, because they were more self-sufficient with more factory-style industry. Whereas in the South, they relied more on agriculture. President Lincoln created the Medal of Honor in 1861 and signed the Homestead Act in 1862. The Homestead Act, basically what that did was it encouraged people to move west. North Dakota was part of this Homesteading Act. You could get some acres of land. You had to live there for so long. I won't get into the details. You had to live there so long, and then the land would be yours. And then the government would pay you for that. So, anyway, okay, let's get into the two different types of Democrats here. Now, the War Democrats supported the war. Okay, that makes sense. They criticized Lincoln's handling of the war. They thought he was too nice about how he was going about things. Now, this will change. Okay, the North will eventually become more aggressive. But that's going to take a couple years into the fighting. And then Peace Democrats they mostly came from the Midwestern states. Now, Midwest at this time is like Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, those states. They wanted to end the fighting, and they proposed reuniting the states through negotiation. Okay, critics called Peace Democrats copperheads and claimed they encouraged the South. Some said the war dragged on because Confederates believed Peace Democrats would prevail in the North. Um, that is not true. The War Democrats will eventually win out. Um, and the Peace Democrats will eventually kind of fall out. The war dragged on because they thought they would prevail. It didn't. They were called a copperhead because they were a deadly type of snake. Rather than taking offense, the copperheads proudly embraced this label and they wore copper pennies as badges on their clothing. So that's one way to deal with it. If somebody calls you a name, just roll with it. So that's what they did. So life is changing drastically. The United States, after the Civil War, is going to go into some interesting periods in history. Kind of an interesting time, but we'll get more into that later.